I keep wanting to talk about Bill Maher.
Interesting.
And so he was on Sam Harris's show, and he said, this is the only quote that I have from him. He said, we should have 7 liberal justices on the Supreme Court. And his reasoning there is that if we were a true democracy, Bush would not have been elected, so we would have gotten a liberal justice from that presidency, and then also Donald Trump wouldn't have been elected, so we would have gotten 2 liberal justices from this presidency. So in our true U.S. democracy alternate timeline, we would actually have 7 liberal justices.
That's the worst take I've
ever
heard
right?
in my entire life.
I had to stop the podcast and write it down because it was so stupid.
Oh boy. Well, Bill Maher is sometimes known.
The whole point of the Supreme Court is that it shouldn't be subjected to democratic vote.
Right.
That. It's a non-political entity.
I mean, honestly, we shouldn't even have juries anymore. We should just, every single legal case, we should just open up as a referendum to the entire nation. And then they can decide whether people are guilty or not. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what courts, courts are actually just, a medieval patriarchal institution.
No, we have the technology now. Just send a presidential notice to every person's cell phone at once and just yes or no on this referendum, just 10 times a day, all day, every day.
Yeah, like Tinder, but for a criminal conviction.
Swipe left.
Does this person look guilty to you? Swipe left. Oh no, he's cute. That's a right. That's an acquittal.
Hello again. Welcome back to Grokking Points. Today's a special episode. We're going to do a little bit on local politics. We live in California, so we're mostly going to talk about California's local election, our referendums, and the governor race. What else are we going to get into?
Well, there's some national politics stuff.
I guess we should say our names. I'm Travis.
I'm Alex. Welcome to Grokking Points. We'll talk about national politics a little bit just because, the midterm elections are coming up. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be more concerned with their local politics, which I feel like is not the dominant paradigm. A lot of the time, people are concerned about, what's the president doing? What's the Supreme Court doing? What's the Congress doing?
Yeah, that's the WWE, the national stage. Nobody cares about their local stuff.
Yeah. But, I mean, I assume a lot of local stuff ends up being more... It's still WWE, but it's maybe just a smaller scale. It's like MMA, or is MMA bigger than WWE now?
I don't know.
Or UFC, or I don't know the acronyms. Wait, what's WWF?
That's the Federation. I don't think that exists anymore.
Oh, okay.
So
now it's just the panda thing.
Yeah, WWF just protects pandas now.
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, so we will talk about national stuff a little bit. I mean, to me, this is really more, it's less a conversation about California politics in particular, and it's more about how to approach local elections. How do people feel about, state versus county versus national politics? How do you look at your ballot and not blow your brains out? How do you address mental health issues? Stuff like that. So I think that to me, that's how I'm approaching this is from a more like a procedural perspective.
Sure. Okay, so what's the procedure?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, so we just got our packets and everything in. I don't know how it works in other states, but in California, they send you in the mail this big packet of paper that sort of goes through all of the candidates, all of the local propositions and measures, and then has little blurbs about everything and the pro and con arguments, and then it gives you a sample ballot. And then eventually, of course, you get your real ballot that you can fill out. And so presumably this packet of paper, it's kind of like newspaper, thin, cheap stuff. This is how a lot of people are, this is the information that they get to make decisions about the elections. Is that what you do? Do you read these pamphlets, packets?
I don't read the one that they send me. Yeah, I go online and read the little pro and con blurbs.
Do you go do Ballotpedia or?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the main thing I do too. I think a lot of people don't do this. I haven't done a poll on this or a census or anything, but my impression is that I think the dominant paradigm is you just go in with your ballot and then just kind of choose the thing that looks like it makes sense when you read it. And that's, if I had to guess randomly, I'd say 50% of people probably do that.
Yeah.
And then maybe 25 to 40% of people take the pamphlet and like sort of go through it and then read some of the pro and cons and then actually decide on the stuff. And then maybe 10% of people like really dive deep and, you know, are sort of more engaged in politics and have like special knowledge of the issues and do, you know, research on Ballotpedia and everything like that. But my guess is the vast majority of voters aren't doing that. Is this your impression? What do you think goes on?
I mean, yeah, nobody really ever comes up and talks to me about local politics. I've rarely ever engaged in a conversation about some specific referendum. I think people talk about like the governor race a fair amount. But yeah, I don't think the average person really dives deep into these.
I'm curious about maybe we can just start with this about governor in particular, because so in California, obviously it's a very heavily liberal dominated state, and I mean, you know, clearly there's pockets of Republicans and conservatism, but for the most part it's liberally dominated. And so I could imagine there being a lot of debate going up through the primary, like in terms of selecting the Democrat Party candidate. But I haven't heard a lot of talk between the two candidates now, the Democrat and the Republican candidate. And I'm curious, in like a liberally dominated state, do you think that's a real conversation? Or do you think people are just going to vote their party line? And if so, is the candidate like predetermined in a certain sense, or do you think is there a real debate going on here?
I haven't looked at the numbers on the likelihood of who's likely to win. I think Gavin Newsom is likely to win, but I think most people are probably going to vote along party lines. For the people who are on the fence, I think John Cox is a really good Republican candidate in California. He's really avoided talking about any social issues at all. When his liberal opponents bring those up, he's explicitly stated that those aren't the policies that I'm running on. You know, I have opinions about these things, but you know, I'm really just trying to fix this budget crisis in this state.
Sure.
And so I think that's probably the correct tack for a Republican to take to try and win California, but I'm not sure how many people are actually going to be swayed by it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that until I put in the effort to like evaluate the candidates and look at what they're doing for this episode, I didn't really know who John Cox was. Like I had heard his name before, but I didn't really know anything about him. Didn't know what his face looked like. Didn't know what sort of policies he supported. And I'm you know, I wouldn't say I'm like an expert on him at all, but I had some notes, and so if I'm going to describe John Cox and Gavin Newsom in a couple words, I'd say that, you know, funny enough, Gavin Newsom is kind of like the establishment, quote, candidate, and John Cox is kind of like the, quote, maverick, which it kind of reminds me of the, you know, the McCain/Palin type politics, where in the context of California, the liberals are the establishment party, right? And especially Gavin Newsom in particular, obviously, you know, he's been in politics for a very long time, and we've heard his name. He's been very actively involved in the political makeup of California for, would you say, decades? At least a decade. Whereas John Cox, I've personally never heard of him, and his quote maverick, you know, his radical platform is fiscal responsibility, which is kind of funny. And then Gavin Newsom's like establishment status quo politics is like progressivism. So that's interesting to me, and I do wonder how that's going to end up playing out at the polls. But you know, I have no level of statistical sophistication about that. But I mean, I think it's something that's worth considering. I mean, I think a lot of Californians have, you know, if they're sorting by party lines, I assume the liberals are thinking, like, there's no way we can ever vote for a Republican, especially one who supports Trump. It's a very, like, aesthetic sort of decision about, you know, this is just another old white guy. I mean, they're both old white guys. Yeah. But there's another old white guy who seems a little bit more like Trump. He kind of has a comb over. He's talking about, quote, fiscal responsibility, but this may be, like, coded language for you know, white supremacy or whatever. But then John Cox and whoever's supporting him is probably seeing him as like, you know, things in California haven't been going great in the past few years, and the Liberal Party, quote, the establishment, you know, their policies haven't seemed to be working. They don't seem to be working for us, you know, whether you're like upper middle class or working class. And so maybe we do need a, quote, maverick Republican candidate who is going to be, like you said, get our budget in order and bring down costs, lower taxes, stuff like this.
Do you think there is a perspective that John Cox is Trumpian at all?
Well, I don't think he's Trumpian.
I know he's backed by Trump, but I
Right.
assume Trump is going to back any Republican challenger to the Democratic candidate in California.
Well, that's the thing. Like, personality-wise, he's definitely not Trumpian at all. I mean, you can just listen to an interview of him for 5 minutes. He's clearly like a very sort of reasonable, articulate person.
Yeah.
No offense, Trump, but actually, yes, offense. And I think it's really just that he's Republican he's not like actively denouncing Trump, and therefore he's Trumpian. I mean, he's sort of like falling in line. He's not Ben Sass, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so I think that he's just one of all of the Republicans where they don't really feel like it's politically feasible to go against Trump at this point. Even, it's a standard trope now that people who were never Trumpers 2 years ago are now falling in line because they're realizing that they'll instantly lose all their support if they come out against Trump. I mean, Mitt Romney has recently done this. Ben Shapiro has pretty much done it. There's some few hardline never Trumpers like David Frum, but I mean, for the most part, the Republican Party isn't taking them very seriously anymore. That's kind of the place that we're finding ourselves in. Sorry, bringing it back to California, I feel like John Cox is... If I had to guess, I would say him personally probably doesn't like Trump that much. He just feels like this is a political necessity.
Yeah.
And especially because he was endorsed by Trump. That's basically the only way he would have a fighting chance in this election.
Yeah, I imagine that a Trump endorsement probably does more good than harm for his campaign. I mean, I guess, should we look at the numbers real quick?
Well, I mean, I don't... we can. I don't want to be that kind of podcast. I don't want to be wonky about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Like, I mean, based on what you know about them, how would you go about making this decision? Like, what are you thinking through?
Well, there has been one debate between them on the radio, which I have not listened to. But
this is like I think it was on KQED or KRPQ or one of these things that starts with K and has 4 letters.
Yeah.
I started listening to it. I didn't finish it, but it was...
Pretty dry?
It was pretty dry, yeah. It was pretty... Well, the thing is, it wasn't a debate. It was like a conversation with these two. And so there's a quote moderator, but they weren't really debating. They were just kind of like taking turns, making comments that were occasionally kind of passive-aggressive, but it wasn't a formal debate.
So I would want to look at the fiscal issues, especially that I care about in California, and see how they line up against those.
So what do you care about?
I guess mostly I care about housing and not going into debt. So
okay, sounds like you're a John Cox man to me. Or to for brevity, you're a Cox man. Well, do you love Cox?
I don't know.
Do you have mixed opinions on Cox?
Yeah, I kind of grok Cox. Yeah, I don't know what his positions on low income housing is. I don't know. I'm kind of all over the map here. Like, we're going to discuss a few housing propositions later on, and I have mixed feelings about those. So like really I want more housing in California, but I want it to be done in the right way. And I don't know.
So what's the right way?
Yeah.
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, I mean I don't know. What are you leaning towards between these two?
I do want to do a little bit more research. I'm inclined so I like Cox. It's well known. Mm-hmm. Anyway, better than Dick Cheney, I guess. So, what if your name was Dick Cox? Okay, sorry. We're adults here. We're all adults.
If your name is Richard Cox, I don't think that's the way that you abbreviate it.
I don't know, man. Why would you ever go by Dick anyway?
Yeah.
Or Tricky Dick was like an unironic... Okay, anyway, so John Cox. I listened to a couple interviews by him. I mean, to talk about this at a higher level of like, how do I go about deciding between candidates? There's like a few, actually, let's get away from the John Cox and Gavin Newsom debate for like a second, because obviously people in different states are going to have different gubernatorial candidates. They'll have different, congressional candidates and everything that they're considering. And I kind of want to briefly talk about like what sort of factors are you considering when going through these candidates? By the paradigm I previously mentioned of like, I think a lot of people just kind of browse through the ballot and then pick whatever seems the most reasonable to them. I sort of laid out here, I have this list of factors that somebody might consider when they're considering a candidate. And then I ranked these factors in terms of, I should have better words for this, but how good of a factor is it in actually determining the quality of the candidate? And then how important it is to people when they're making the decision. Mm-hmm. And I want you to tell me what you think about this. So this was mostly just... This is just stream of consciousness. So the first thing I thought of was party affiliation. If you have no idea who the candidates are, you'll just say, do they match my party affiliation? And then I might vote for them. The second thing is the blurb that's in the pamphlets or in the ballot information packets. And so, I mean, I assume a lot of people will sort of read through those, get a general summary of the person, and maybe like what their job title is, and nominally what sort of things they support. The third thing, which I assume is important for a lot of people, even if they don't think that is annoying campaign ads. I'm sure if you are a person that lives in the world, you have gotten, phone calls, you've gotten papers inside of your mailbox, you've seen signs everywhere, you've heard stuff on the radio. There's just ads everywhere, and they have to be doing something or else people wouldn't spend so much freaking money on them. So probably the name recognition comes up there. Then we've got coolness of name. For better or for worse, I assume there are a lot of people that make decisions based on how cool the name sounds.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not like literally how cool it is, but if there's just something resonance about the name, maybe Gavin Newsom is more likely to get elected than, I don't know. It's hard for me to come up with a like Jovanka Beckles or something, which is actually, am I pronouncing that name right? Is
that a real person?
Yeah. She's running for I think mayor of Oakland shit, I forget the office, but I've seen signs with her a lot. But if you are, maybe that's a cooler name if you're trying to go against the old white guy sort of grade. And then we get to actual policy positions, which I assume would be one of the more important factors for considering a candidate, but probably a lot of people don't have great knowledge of what these are unless you're really paying attention. And then there's conversations, debates, like recorded interviews and stuff. Again, you kind of have to put in a lot of time, like especially outside of the ballot information, pamphlet information, in order to know this stuff. And then the last, like, deepest level is personal knowledge of the person. Like, have you met them? Do you know them? Do you know people who know them? And can you attest to their character? Does that seem like a comprehensive overview, or are there other sort of factors you think people consider in candidates?
Yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable. I think, I don't know if they're in that order exactly.
This is just the order that they came up in my brain.
Sure.
Of like what I would, like the order that I feel like I consider things.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some of those that are higher priority. I think everybody's going to weigh them differently. But yeah, that seems pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, just going through these real quickly, it seems like if you're going to make the best, most informed decision, like the best types of information is the deeper stuff, like, do you have knowledge of the person? Have you listened to conversations and debates about them? But of course, this is much more difficult information to come by. And then there's stuff that is very easy information to come by that is more likely to inform people's decisions. And this is first and foremost the party affiliation, and then the blurb in the pamphlet. I feel like most people are making decisions based on those factors, even if they maybe don't have as much information in them. And then there's stuff that is unfortunately important, but literally has no bearing on how good the candidate is, and that's the prevalence of annoying ads and the coolness of name.
Well, I mean, I don't want to jump the gun on whether or not a cool named governor is going to perform more or less well. There's
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
There's a joke there. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, did you see this movie? I forget what it's called, but there's this old Eddie Murphy movie where he wants to run for political office, and literally his entire strategy is like rent a van with these speakers on top of it, and then just say his name over and over again and like drive through the streets.
Was that Bowfinger? What was that?
I don't actually remember the name of the movie, but this is like his entire campaign strategy, and then he eventually ends up winning because people just like remember his name. They're like, oh, I've heard that name before, and then they like vote for him on the thing. Yeah. I mean, you have to think that this is at least some non-negligible portion of why Trump won, is that his name is just like super recognizable, right? And the prevalence of annoying ads, which maybe not as much in Trump's favor, but like for these local elections, I'm just seeing ads everywhere, and it's hard to imagine that like association of just recognizing the name, it's hard to imagine that doesn't matter.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure it does.
Maybe that's embedded in the coolness of name.
It matters in more than just the political sphere. It matters, like that's how advertising works in general, right?
Do you know, is it common for political candidates to take on alias names that sound cooler? Kind of like how people in Hollywood or like porn will take on different names? I
don't think it's so common, just because there's probably an easy attack ad depending on how you do that. Like, I don't know, if you're trying to get your name to sound less Jewy, or something.
Jewy?
Yeah, like Jon Stewart did that. His real name's like John, some long Jewish name that's hard to pronounce.
Wait, seriously? It's not Jon Stewart?
Yeah.
Oh my god. It's like full globalist conspiracy going on here. Right? I didn't know that. I mean, I guess I didn't even know he was Jewish. Literally everyone is Jewish.
I know, right?
It's really weird. I'm Jewish. No, I'm not. But but I'm not going to become famous because of that. Just kidding. Maybe. Globalist conspiracy sidebar conversation here. I feel like every single day I find out that another podcast I listen to is hosted by a Jewish guy, and I didn't even realize it for like 5 years that this person was Jewish.
Yeah.
And it just like keeps happening. Like I found out that Jonathan Haidt was Jewish recently. I actually had no idea that he was Jewish, but I've been reading his books for years. But anyway, I mean, that's fine. I like Jews, I guess. I mean, I like people. I like humans, and some of them happen to be Jews. There's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, and so like when we're talking about governor, like John Cox versus Gavin Newsom, obviously, the bigger the office, the more recognizable the names, probably the more healthy the debate will be around it, because people will sort of have the time and inclination to go and find information about their policy positions and stuff. But most of the time when you read through these packets, there's like 40 different positions down to like, state office clerk or whatever. And nobody has any idea who these people are. Like, how do you decide, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems really bad just because if the only way that you're making these decisions is like, what's their party affiliation, what's their blurb in this piece of paper that you read for 10 seconds, and what's their job title, and like, does it sound cool or not?
Yeah.
I mean, this is essentially a job interview, because you're electing this person to like make decisions about how possibly millions of dollars are going to be spent of your tax money. And so you're essentially interviewing these people, but I can't imagine that anyone is really looking at this deeply.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember one of the previous election cycles, I was looking at like, I don't know, my local city council or something, and at least one of the positions, my eyes just totally glazed over at all the names. So all I saw was like, name one, and then this person is like a journalist or a lawyer or something, and then name two, and that person's like a geologist. And so like at that point, I just have to just fill in the box based on occupation.
Yeah. Like, oh, engineers are cool. I wish we had more engineers in government.
Yeah, and then later on, my girlfriend asked me how I voted, and I told her, oh yeah, I voted for the geologist. So like, oh, that's not the one you're supposed to vote for.
Yeah, that guy's actually a Nazi. You didn't see. He's he believes
Nazi
like,
geologist.
Yeah,
Nazi rocks.
White sand is superior to black sand or something. White sand supremacist. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I still personally find it like part of my identity is, I'm a person who I really care about politics. I'm an informed citizen. I'm gonna, engage in my civic responsibility. But then I just look at the information pack and I'm like, fuck this shit, man. Like, I have no idea what's going on. And then that kind of makes me feel bad, because it's like, well, what was the point of this whole identity of being like a smart, informed citizen if I'm actually not and I have no idea what's going on, especially at a local level. But it's hard. I don't know how you could be more informed without spending like an entire week just looking into everybody.
It's a lot of work for something that doesn't really have a payoff, because all you do is like you put in all this work, you become informed, you go to the ballot box, and then the results are just what they are 2 weeks later. And then you never think about any of that work that you did ever again. I mean, especially with like the local county referendums, those are real hard. Like there's just so many of them to consider.
Well, do you want to get into the propositions and the measures then?
Yeah, let's do that.
Sure. So with regard to, I mean, again, I'm not quite sure how it works in all the other states, but in California, you've got the propositions, which refers to sort of the statutes and policies that are going to affect the entire state. And then you've got the local measures. There's usually much more of these, and they're more particular to your county or city or whatever it is, right? And so, of course, most of the time when people are discussing these things, they're going to talk about the propositions, because they're sort of the big ones.
They're the big juicy ones.
Yeah, this is where you get stuff like Prop 8, which years ago was about, the gay marriage in California.
Yeah.
You've got Prop 13, which goes back a few decades, that sort of locked in property tax levels. Do you know about this one? So these end up being the big juicy debates. How do you go about thinking about these propositions?
Well, I think it's pretty particular to the propositions themselves. Do you want to just go down? Let's go down 1 through 12 and just talk about how we came to the conclusion.
So you don't have like a meta strategy. You just sort of go proposition by proposition and then decide case by case.
Yeah, kind of. I don't think that besides actually just reading the basic pros and con blurb, there's no one thing that I did for every single policy.
Well, do you mind if I talk about that article I sent you? So I was influenced in the past, I used to do basically what you're doing, and I used to write a blog where I would go through each proposition and sort of outline my thoughts on it and then my decision. And I mean, I still do that, but I've been recently swayed by this article I read, which we can link in the description. Let me pull it up here. So there's this Medium writer that I really like. His name is Michael Levinson, and in 2016 he wrote this article on Medium called "Why I Vote No on Almost All California Ballot Propositions, Even If I Agree with Them." We don't have to go too deep into this, but basically his argument goes like this. We live in a representative democracy, and most of the time the way that laws get passed is through the state legislature. So there's people who are elected into as lawmakers, and there's policy analysts, there's lobbyists, there's committees. There's sort of this process by which people write and decide and pass laws, and this is what we generally think about as our democratic process. It's really a democratic Republican process of stacked layers of representation. And so in California, we have this referendum system where if there's something that either can't be passed as policy because of maybe it's a more fundamental like civil rights issue. It's not just like a wonky budget thing, or if it's
even though half of these are wonky budget things.
Well, sure. Well, exactly. This is what we're going to get to. Or there's certain budget approvals that have to be passed by referendum. But for the most part, laws are sort of intended to be crafted and passed by the legislature, and only in extreme circumstances or special circumstances do things go through this public direct democracy style referendum vote. But so Levinson's argument is the default should always be to vote no on the propositions, because this shouldn't be how law is passed. The propositions are intended for a particular purpose, which is when lawmakers have failed, this is sort of like an emergency valve that the public can turn in order to pass laws that are necessary or to approve of budgets. And so, or to approve of bond measures, basically. And so his argument is you should vote no on everything unless they fulfill some very particular criteria. And so the criteria that he mentions are, there's three main ones. He says compelling interest. Is this of such dire importance that the quote nuclear option is called for of direct democratic public referendum? The 38-year test, that is when a proposition is passed, it's basically ensconced into law for 38 years. And so it's very important that the laws are sustainable. And so is it well drafted? Is it clear and concise? Not overly specific and reasonably future proof. So if something, changes in a few years, if the economic or cultural, like climate landscape changes, have we passed a law that is unwise? And then there's the last resort test. This is the third criterion. Is there a really good reason why it can't become law the normal way through the legislative process? Levinson finds that almost all measures and propositions fail to pass at least one of these criteria, and therefore, and sometimes even fail all of the criteria, and therefore should be voted no on. And so this strategy of does it pass these criteria is very distinct from the strategy of do I agree with each of these things? Because there's a lot of situations where you might agree with a particular law, like on its face, but you don't agree about the process, like the way that it should be passed is through this public referendum instead of through the legislature. So that's kind of how I've been approaching voting the last couple of years.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that strategy?
So you've sent me this article before, and I've been thinking about it, and I agree with it from a philosophical sense. I agree that referendums are kind of a bad way to institute policy and create reform, just because direct democracy can go so wrong. We have lots of examples of that happening. Brexit is a really good one. The public is really easily swayed, especially in these really wonky decisions. It can end up making bad choices. And I like a lot of the points that this article makes. I think there is a problem with some of these referendums just not being future proof, where they just have such bad consequences later down the line that were hard to foresee. And when it's a referendum like that, it's difficult to go back on it when it's not something that wasn't pushed through the normal legislative process. My problems with this article is that I think, like, strategically it can be a bad way to vote, just because we live in a world, if you live in California, we live in this state that uses these referendums this way. So if you do agree with a policy, and so say you're looking at this referendum and it passes the future proofing test, like it's something that's just gonna appropriate a certain amount of funds for, this one project, and that's all it does. And 20 years down the road, it doesn't do anything. But it doesn't pass the last resort test. Like, you look at it and you don't see any reason why it couldn't just be pushed through the normal process. The problem with an automatic no on that is, I think these referendums do inform the traditional process of like what's reasonably going to get passed and what the voters want. So if I really think that the state needs this particular program or project, but I vote no, and it turns out 40% of the state voted yes, and then lawmakers in the future use that as kind of a guideline for what the people want and what's reasonably going to be passed through the normal process, that might not align with what I want.
Well, but then, like, I don't fully understand this view of viewing the outcome of a referendum that is like literally passing policies into law as like a source of information about the demographics, because you could also just poll people, or you could just like call them up and ask like, hey, if I'm your representative, I'm thinking about passing this law, would you elect me on the basis that I'm supporting this law?
I mean, you're gonna poll people either way, but an actual vote on policy is that's a poll in itself.
But then if the poll turns up yes, it actually happens and is in law for 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, assuming it's one of those. I do think that this like future proofing test is a good test, and this article has convinced me that is a good test. I think the other two tests are basically the same. The two are the compelling interest test. Is this of such dire importance that the nuclear option is called for? And then the last resort test, is there a good reason why it can't become a law the normal way? I think that's kind of the same thing.
Well, I'm not sure it's the same, because you could easily have situations that are dire importance, but could also be passed the normal way. And so therefore it's just a law that you would support normally at the state legislature level.
But could you have it the other way around? Like, if it's direly important such that the nuclear option is called for, there's good reasons why it can't be a law. Like, I don't see how that works.
The other way around is there's something that can't become a law the normal way, but is not of dire importance, right? So something that, and that's a case that could certainly be irrelevant. So like, so what's something that couldn't become a law the normal way? Maybe the process by which laws are decided. So for instance, whether whether any given, say that the legislature wants to increase taxes in order to pay for like a dam or something, right? Or a public infrastructure project. And so we want some rule that says the legislature cannot pass tax increases unless it has a 2/3 majority vote, like 66% or something. Obviously that can't pass inside of the legislature, because it's changed the rules of the legislature. You would sort of want it to happen on a public referendum basis, but maybe we don't care to amend that process because the process is working fine as is. Sure. Or maybe that's not something that's super important to amend, because the way that they're dealing with public infrastructure projects right now is fine. And so that's a situation where it might not pass. It might pass the last resort test because it can't become law the normal way, but it wouldn't pass the compelling interest test because it's just not something that's important.
That makes sense. I still think that these are the first and the third test. I still think are relatively vague. It's hard to like definitively put something in one camp or the other. Whether something is of dire importance is going to be super influenced by your partisan values, and whether something can or can't become a law the normal way is actually really hard to figure out.
I mean, a lot of the stuff is hard to figure out, right?
But I do like this article. I like that we should have this kind of in mind when we look at referendums. Like, these are a really big deal. Like, we can't just use these for everything. They can have consequences that stretch for decades. Like, that is a good thing to keep in mind. But I think that, like, the number one issue for me is the future proofing. Like, the fact that they can be consequential for such a long time, and it's just this one-time Democratic vote. That's like, you know, the big issue, the fly in the ointment or whatever. So I do like going into this conversation with that as a baseline, but I'm personally, I don't use this as a strategy of like just no by default. It doesn't even really work for some of them.
Right. I mean, I think the question is,
like, repeal the gas tax, like, you know, going into that, like, no by default, it doesn't actually make sense.
Right, you'd have to flip it. You'd have to flip it. And he does talk about that when, you know, he goes on, Levinson goes on to break down his decision on each proposition,
Sure.
and he will say, oh, if the proposition is worded in such a way that's actually going to repeal something instead of make a new law, then you have to sort of flip the way that you're thinking about yes and no, which is reasonable. But I mean, I think the overall notion about voting no by default, it's not to say that you should vote no on everything. It's to say that if you're not sure, your bias shouldn't be in favor of yes.
Yeah.
And I do feel that a lot of people, whether intentionally or not, especially more sort of progressively minded people, will go into it and see something that, you know, they'll sort of read a blurb and they'll say, this is the save children from their throats getting slit by terrorists law. And they're like, oh, I don't like children's throats getting slit by terrorists, so I guess I will vote for this like $10 billion, you know, Save the Children fund or something. And I mean, obviously that's a gross characterization.
Sure.
But I think that, gross caricature. But I think that a lot of people do sort of, you know, they'll read the initiatives and say, well, that sounds like a good idea, and it's definitely something I would support, and I don't mind paying a little bit higher taxes, so sure, I'll vote for it. And so I think for them, a lot of the time, it's about almost proving a negative. It's like, demonstrate to me that this law isn't a good idea, and then they sort of like do their homework and they're like, well, I've looked into it more and I decided to vote no. But I think what should be the case is that the default is vote no, and then if you look into it and you decide, oh, this is something that, you know, I really care about, or it's really important that we pass this, then sure, you know, it's fine to vote yes, and you don't have to stick to these criteria totally strictly. But the point of it isn't these are hard and fast rules. It's more like, you should start looking at every single proposition with a critical eye. Like, do we really need this?
Yeah.
Not just, do I agree with it?
That's why I find this article valuable. I still bristle at the headline here, which is, I vote no on almost all ballot propositions. I'm not voting no on almost all ballot propositions this year.
So you're voting yes on most of them, or?
No. I'm just not voting no on almost all of them.
But what would be the opposite? Well, what do you count as almost all? Because like in this case, when he goes through them, he votes yes on like 3 out of 10 or something.
Well, that's not almost all.
Is almost all.
That's like 7 out of. That's like is 70% almost all?
Well, okay. Let me show.
I think almost all is like 80 to 90%. That's what I would call almost all.
Fair enough, but let me give an alternate view here. So I looked at, like,
my whole criticism here, my whole pushback. The point of my pushback here is that I like this as a framework for viewing these propositions, but not if the end result is going to be this almost always no idea. Like, I just don't think. I think enough of these propositions pass these like vague tests that I don't think that that's a reasonable outcome for this strategy.
Well, let me show you. Okay, so here's an example of why this matters. So looking at the propositions from earlier this year, where in June, well, this is right, in June 2018. So we voted on these earlier propositions, Proposition 68, there's 5 of them, 68, 69, 70, 71, and 72. And so if you look at the way that newspapers endorse these, for instance, like this is how, obviously newspapers don't, this isn't the way everybody votes, but it's a reasonable representation of how some people tried to decide these things. And so if you look at the biggest newspapers that are supporting or opposing propositions, here you've got on Ballotpedia, there's an article that shows LA Times, Mercury News, Orange County Register, Sacramento Bee, San Diego Union Tribune. So these are all like local, well-known newspapers and how they supported propositions. And for the most part, they tend to support almost everything. Or when they do oppose a proposition, there's like some particular proposition that they all sort of align on in opposing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, these are these like negative sort of propositions. But in general, they're like, oh, do we agree with this? Yes, then we support it. And so I think, and when I've just like been talking to my friends, it seems like a relatively common thing that people will support many or like a majority of the propositions.
Yeah.
Here, if you look at the Democratic Party, the positions of the political parties on the propositions, you've got the Democratic Party supporting 7 out of the 11 propositions, and only opposing 3 of them, where one of them is the repeal of a previous increase, and therefore this is like just a continuation. So really 8 out of 11 of these are in support of additional legislation. And obviously the Democratic Party is the dominant one in California. And even the Republican Party supports like half of them.
Yeah.
And so it's only the Libertarian Party that opposes a majority of them. And I feel like that has got to be the general way that you're approaching these sorts of measures. I mean, it hasn't got to be. I mean, I suppose that's my libertarian bent. But even if you don't want like a libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, small government state or whatever, even if you don't want that, it still makes sense to me to go by these general rules of not, every 2 years voting through like everything that just what I don't want is the criterion for law to be passed is, does it get enough petition signatures?
Yeah.
And
does it sound good on the paper?
And did it sound good on paper?
Yeah, no,
because I think that's
I
the incentives that are driving a lot of people.
Yeah, I think this, like I said, I think this article is valuable in that I think there are nuances to these referendums that people don't get, and this is like a valuable framework for looking at them. I just don't want to, I just don't think it's the only framework, and it's not necessarily like the hard and fast framework that I use.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the only framework because almost everybody doesn't vote this way at all. Yeah. They just go by like gut level intuitions.
Okay, well, so do you want to go through the propositions now and kind of explain how you used this strategy?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about our opinions on each of them.
Yeah, sure. Well, so Levinson came out with another article in 2018, How I'm Voting on Ballot Propositions, November 2018. And I'm not going to agree with him on everything. Well, actually, I pretty much do. But I like his framing, which is he sort of categorizes these propositions into bond initiatives, which is like how the government is getting funding to pay for infrastructure projects and social programs and stuff. Tax initiatives, so changes to the tax structure. And most propositions fall into one of these two paradigms. So for the bond initiatives, which you can start on, we've got propositions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Propositions 1 and 2 have a lot in common because they're about homelessness and affordable housing in California. Yeah. And then these will later have some in common with propositions 10 and C as well. So how do you feel about these propositions in general?
So the first one is $4 billion in bonds going to housing-related programs for veterans. I am in support of this one. It's different than the Prop 2, which is Prop 2 doesn't appropriate more money. It uses already existing funds from a tax that we voted in previously. So I like both of them because housing is kind of my one issue for California. Yeah, but it's by far our biggest problem. Yeah, almost everybody agrees that it's a huge issue. And so, yeah, I'm pro building more houses. I assume that $4 billion is like, it's going to go towards the stuff that it's said to go towards.
Yeah, well, that already is maybe a questionable assumption. Yeah. But, I mean, a big issue with a lot of these propositions that have to do with bond initiatives is the money actually going to be spent in a responsible way? And I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, it's very hard to actually evaluate that like dispassionately. Again, what I don't want to do is just have this incentive structure of if you get on the ballot and it sounds good, then it's going to be passed, because of course that doesn't guarantee any level of fiscal responsibility. So I think there's a reasonable prior that says if you're not sure, like you don't really know how it works, it's sort of safer to vote no, because then you're not appropriating new funds to be spent in a this sort of vague, like opaque, untransparent way that like an average citizen isn't informed about. That being said, I sort of agree about these two propositions, Proposition 1 and 2. Clearly, housing, it's gone to crisis levels in California. It's really, really bad. And obviously, this disproportionately affects people like veterans and homeless people. I mean, obviously homeless people, because they're literally homeless, but also, poorer people. And so, and the solution to this, in my view, has to be more housing, and it has to be stuff like programs and loans and what does this say? General obligation bonds for housing related programs, loans, grants, and projects, and housing loans for veterans. That's California Proposition 1. And then California Proposition 2. Yeah, so as you said, this is just appropriating money that was already passed to be spent on mental health services, homelessness prevention, housing for persons in need of mental health services.
Yeah.
And again, this is like, if you're going to diagnose homelessness as a problem, it's got to be vast majority because of mental health issues.
Yeah,
and this is the type of thing we need to address those problems.
Even if you're an extreme fiscal conservative, I think Prop 2 is a really obvious yes. Just because that money's already gone. The state already has the money. So like, what's the most dire place that we can put that money in? It's in housing.
And the Republican Party is in support of this. I think maybe the only party that wasn't is Libertarian. Let me see. Green Party doesn't have a strong opinion because it's probably not enough about fish. But they don't have a strong opinion. But Democratic Party, Republican Party. Okay, sounds like, to me, this passes the criteria of this is something that's really important. It's basically at a crisis level. This doesn't like permanently change the law. This is passing funds for something that has to be done sooner rather than later. And so it passes the quote 38-year test for me. I'm not totally sure why this couldn't be passed as a normal law, except I believe that the way bond stuff works has to be passed through a referendum. And so I think this is just, it satisfies all the criteria and is really important and something that I care about as well.
Yeah.
And it's long overdue for California. So now there's this other Proposition C, which I actually don't see on here, but Proposition C is a thing, right?
I haven't looked into C. What is C?
I thought, let me see if I can find it. I thought this was a thing. Maybe I'm just being crazy. I thought this was a thing that...
it's just San Francisco?
Oh, it's just San Francisco. That's why I was confused. I thought, shouldn't it be called a measure if it's just San Francisco? I don't know how the naming works. But so Proposition C is a San Francisco thing, which is about funding housing and homelessness services by increasing tax on businesses. And this one, it was famously supported by Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce. And of course, he is a very prominent figure in San Francisco. I mean, he obviously built the Salesforce Tower and the funded the Transbay terminal and stuff. And so he's very invested in, the San Francisco development. And so he has this big platform of support Prop C. This is a very simple proposition. You're either in support of homeless or you're not. And so vote yes on Prop C if you're in support of homeless. And I think that's like kind of a stupid framing. And if you look into the proposition, I don't think it doesn't really seem to address the root of the problem, and also costs a ton of money. It's not very clear how the money is going to be spent. And it also benefits, the tax structure benefits high margin companies, aka software companies, aka Salesforce and its clients. And it's supported by Mark Benioff. I don't know. So I think there's, just to contrast this with Propositions 1 and 2, I think 1 and 2 are sort of more sustainable, smarter approaches to helping the homelessness and like affordability crisis in California.
Yeah, at the very least,
see this proposition doing that.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, 1 and 2, it's like a one-time fund appropriation, whereas this is a permanent increase on taxing certain businesses that bring in over a certain amount of revenue.
And then what about Propositions 3 and 4? We've got so Proposition 3 is called Water Infrastructure and Watershed Conservation Bond Initiative 2018. This authorizes $8.877 billion with a B in general obligation bonds for water infrastructure, groundwater supplies and storage, surface water storage and dam repairs, watershed and fisheries improvements, and habitat protection and restoration. And then 4, which is the last bond initiative, is Children's Hospital Bonds Initiative, aka Do You Care About Children or Not initiative. A yes vote supports $1.5 billion in bonds for construction, expansion, renovation, and equipping of children's hospitals in California.
Okay, well, look at the water one first, I guess.
Sure.
I don't have a strong opinion on this one. I'm still a little bit undecided. I guess with the Levinson strategy, this would probably be a no.
He was very, very strongly no on this one.
Yeah.
He was like, this is just a way to try and convince oversensitive liberals to support special interests. Like, don't be a sucker, vote no. All caps.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't know what special interests this supports.
Mostly like water industry people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can see why somebody who's like environmentally inclined might be kind of positive on this. We've had water issues in the state pretty recently. I don't know whether like infrastructure and groundwater supplies are the solution to that, and close to $9 billion is a whole lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, and it's hard to imagine that any citizen really knows what's going on here. I mean, I don't know what's going on, and I studied civil engineering at Berkeley. So, I mean, sorry, that sounded like really smug and braggy. But my point is that, like, this is something that seems like this should go through a typical legislative process. Yeah. This doesn't sound like a referendum type situation. So there's this other thing. Let me see if I can find it in here. On Ballotpedia, they do this thing called readability score, which I think is really interesting, where they will score, they basically do like a textual analysis of the proposition titles as well as their the text in the pamphlet. And then they grade it based on what grade level a person needs to be at in order to actually understand the proposition. And so in this case, they have two different metrics, the Flesch-Kincaid grade level metric and the Flesch reading ease formula. So they're both different ways to calculate the readability of the text. And so in this particular one, they decided that the FKGL, Flesch-Kincaid grade level, for the ballot title is grade level 14, meaning you cannot understand what this proposition is about unless you've completed all of grade school plus 2 years. So this would be like a couple years of college. And then FKGL for ballot summary is grade level 18, meaning that you basically need graduate school level education to understand it, which isn't surprising considering that a lot of the lingo necessary to understand it requires an understanding of like groundwater and stuff.
How does this compare to the last two that we talked about, the other fund?
Yeah, so number one, Proposition 1, which was about bonds for veteran housing programs, FKGL for the title was level 13.5, so about a year and a half more than high school level, and FKGL for the ballot summary is grade level 16, so this is about a university graduate level reading level. And in general, these things are really high. We're just talking about California, but across all states, for the 2017 ballot, the average ballot question required 20 years of U.S. formal education, aka graduate school level of education, to read and comprehend, according to this formula.
That's crazy.
So that's like slightly damning, I would say.
Yeah.
I went through and read this. I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about these things because it's very easy for a person to read the ballot measure and then think that they understood it, because this isn't a test, right? You're not being like graded on your, this is the LSAT. You're not being graded on your comprehension. And so if you think you understand it and then you're like, oh, that sounds good, and you vote for it, it could actually do the exact opposite thing of what you think. Yeah. Or you could just like fundamentally misunderstand its consequences. And this has got to be very common, especially, obviously you can't assume everybody has a graduate level reading level. And so historically, actually, California has been pretty good about these things. Their average reading grade level required is, quote, only 13 years, so like a year above high school graduate level.
Which is low on the, like, we're looking at the list of states right now, and it's pretty low in comparison to the other states. It's like the bottom 5.
So this is a historical, again, you can look at ballotpedia.org, ballot measure readability scores 2017. I think this is fascinating. So this was a study from 2011 showing like the past, all of the propositions that they had in their database. This is from this is actually from 1997 to 2007. And they did the study in 2011. They summed up all of the measures and then calculated their readability score and took the mean. So California's is among the most readable at requiring on average 13 years of education, but they also had the most measures with 105. So presumably there's some that require, some of them will require a much higher reading level because there's so many. And also it's more relevant because more and more of law is being passed this way. So the lowest is Oklahoma with mean of 9, meaning that, it's much easier to understand in that state. And then you very quickly get into like most of the states essentially require graduate level understanding.
Oh my
and
God.
Then,
I'm looking at the maximum number. Like go scroll back down.
Yeah. To the bottom.
Yeah. In Colorado, one measure had a 95 grade. So you need like post PhD education to understand that ballot measure.
I can't even imagine what that would even mean. What's a 95?
I want to know what that
years of
measure
education?
was now.
You need like 12 PhDs.
Yeah. You need a PhD in economics and in engineering and in
like philosophy.
Political science, yeah.
They're like enshrining Kierkegaard's writings into the law. Yeah, and so for some of these states, South Carolina, Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, the average reading level required is above 25 years of education, so post-PhD levels of education, which obviously is absurd. I mean, it doesn't matter so much for like Minnesota, for instance, because they only had one measure in this like 10-year period, and so obviously Minnesota, most of their laws are being passed through the state legislature, not by ballot measure. But then Colorado had 62, and their average reading level required was 27 years.
Yeah.
So that's quite a lot.
This seems like a really big problem for some of these states, because like the ones at the top, it's not like this is some small sample size thing. Like the ones that have the highest level here seem to have the most measures, which is just crazy. Like you scroll down and you get like 80 measures, 60 measures, 30 measures. No, it's not full of ones and twos.
Yeah, it would be good to see maybe like a graph that shows
get the outliers out of here.
Like how many measures versus what's the average reading level, because obviously some of the ones that are lower, so like Vermont again only had one measure in this 10-year period, and their reading level required was master's degree for that one measure, and it's like, well, it doesn't really matter. If you're passing fewer measures, maybe you actually want them to be more sophisticated because these are like very special cases that are being dealt with.
Yeah.
But if you're passing, like California is passing 105 or Texas is passing 84, and Texas is requiring an average level of PhD to even read the measures.
Yeah, Texas's average is graded at 20, which is higher than any California measure. If you go back up, the highest California measure is 18.
Right. Yeah, so that's fairly egregious. I mean, one thing to note is that this was done in 2011, and the latest year it was using was 2007. I believe if you look, I should have done this before the podcast, but if you go and look at the scores for the California propositions this year, they tend to be a little bit higher. So like in this case, what we just looked at, Proposition 1, ballot summary grade level 16, which is above the mean of 13. This is a university graduate level. Proposition 2, this had readability of grade level 17 for the summary. Proposition 3, grade level 18. Proposition 4, grade level 27.
Wow.
And so I think that it's actually going up in California over time compared to 10 years ago. And so this is something that I'm definitely starting to be more aware of and more concerned about.
We need a referendum that makes sure all these referendums are below a certain reading level.
Yeah, so we can go through the readability for each of these just as a mark, but I think it's one of those things where if the required readability is really high, that makes me even more inclined to vote no, because to me that's saying, if people are voting yes on this, it's likely that they're voting yes without really understanding it, and that's a problem. Like I don't want to pass laws that people don't understand. And so even if I did understand and agreed with it, I still might want to vote no, just on principle of like we need to hold people who are writing these laws accountable to making them, if they're going to be open to public referenda, they need to be understandable.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to push something through this way if it's not in a form that the public is going to understand. Like why is it a referendum then?
Yeah. And obviously the argument there, I guess government tyranny type of argument, is that there's certain special interests and lobbyists and people who like have the money to craft these laws to benefit them. If like obviously the people writing them will understand them the most, and the people like spending a bunch of donor money to get them advertised or to get them like on the ballot, they're going to understand them the most. There's going to be this level of information inequality where the people who are writing the laws and trying to get them passed have more information than the people actually voting on them. And to me, that's dangerous. Yeah. I mean, it's dangerous in the same way that like Facebook has more information about you than you do, and therefore they can sort of twist your perceptions of reality in a way that's going to benefit them. There's this inherent asymmetry there, and I think in the face of that, you have to be very, very skeptical.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I've been approaching this. And so, like, for instance, in this children hospital bond initiative that has, grade level 27, like post PhD level required to even read and understand it. It's like, obviously someone's going to read this and be like, oh, hospitals for children, of course I should support this, or else I don't support the children. And I would guess, if we look at the people supporting this one, Democrats are a yes, Green Party's a yes. Interesting that the Peace and Freedom Party is a no on this one. But the argument goes here, and this is what Levinson was saying, is that it's, obviously it seems like something that's important, and hospital infrastructure is important, and it's something that maybe the public should be paying more for. But there's also special interests that are embedded in this. People don't really understand what are the pros and cons, and it's not obvious that this is something that should be passed on a legislative level rather than on like why should the building of these specific hospitals be decided by this specific ballot proposition instead of more general policy around like healthcare or health insurance reform. And so that was pretty compelling to me, and so that makes it likely that I'll vote no on this proposition. Also, grade level 27, that's absurd.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're getting into tax territory, which is fun. So Proposition 5, Property Tax Transfer Initiative, Proposition 6, Voter Approval for Future Gas and Vehicle Taxes, and 2017 Tax Repeal Initiative. What do you think about these guys?
So the first one, Prop 5, tax transfer, what does this do? This allows home buyers who are age 55 or older or severely disabled to transfer their tax assessments with a possible adjustment from their prior home to their new home, no matter the new home's market value or new. So this is basically trying to get seniors and older citizens to move out of their houses and make that property available to other locals or to people moving to the area. Or
you could frame it that way. I would assume that would be listed in the arguments for. A lot of the main arguments against this is this is like it allows old homeowners who have basically benefited from the rising housing prices in California to lock in their taxes so that when they move, they don't have to pay
higher property taxes. Yeah, presumably there's a bunch of seniors who bought their super cheap Bay Area house in like 1968, and they've watched property taxes everywhere else go through the roof, and they're like, well, why would I sell this house just to move maybe to an even nicer house, except I have to pay more property tax. Like I'm on Social Security, I can't afford that. So if that's like the aim of the measure, then it makes sense.
Yeah, the issue with it is it's basically literally an entirely special interest policy. Like there's nothing else about this except for here's a group of people that we're specifically going to benefit with this law. Like that's the entire point of the law, is to distribute it's like to distribute capital to a specific group of people.
You're talking about what, like senior homeowners?
Right, exactly.
That's the special interest?
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what the better ideas are for getting these kinds of people out of their houses and allowing people to move closer to their jobs or stay in their home cities.
Right. Assuming that there is no assuming some sort of like radical deregulation type paradigm where it's just like a pure like free housing market. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about. But in that realm, the incentive would be just like, do you want to move somewhere else? And if you want to move somewhere else, then you can just do that and sell your house. And, you would get whatever profit comes from moving to a cheaper area. If you move to a more expensive area, you have to pay more. And so in this case, it's basically saying, let's have a law that like specifically is going to favor these sort of older, presumably wealthier homeowners. Wealthy just compared to people that don't own homes, and especially in this case, they could move from I assume the way that this works is they can move from a home that has a lower property tax, move to a home that would have a higher property tax because it's more valuable, and then not have to pay that higher property tax.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, this doesn't pass the criteria for me. Like, this doesn't seem like it's something that should be passed by referendum, and I don't like it that it's specifically favoring, coincidentally, a demographic of people that is much more likely to vote on propositions. aka like older, like retired folks. And the way that Levinson described this. Prop 5 in particular panders to senior citizens and realtors and further cements the unfairness of Prop 13. It lets seniors keep their often huge property tax subsidy even when upsizing, all caps, their home, parentheses, exclamation point. Scream from the rooftops no on 5 and shame on anyone who supports it. That's you. Shame on you.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to frame it in a way that like just makes it obvious what the thing's about. I don't know that it's going to be successful in getting these people to move out of their homes. I don't know why. I assume it would be successful as at that to the degree that people take advantage of it. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think some of the housing crisis is caused by these seniors living in these, aging communities, and the children come up in those communities and, they get good jobs and they can't live there anymore, and it acts as this like talent suck from these medium-sized cities. Like I said, I don't know what an alternative way to solve that problem is, and I don't know how good this will be or how effective this will be at solving the problem. But yeah, I agree. It's worrying to put it in place by referendum, just because it's so hard to overturn these.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where obviously housing markets are really complicated and people don't really understand how they work. I mean, even the like pro YIMBY people, for the most part, it's like it's a general approach to policy. It's not like everybody knows exactly what's going to work out the best in any any given situation. And so I think in something like this, the prior is something like, in general, don't support laws that are going to benefit incumbents. Like don't like if your issue is like affordable housing and access to housing, any law that is going to favor people that already own houses is not in the right direction. I don't think that's always the case, but I think if you're not quite sure on the effects, that's like a reasonable framing of looking at it. And like this in particular, it's not clear whether it's going to help build new houses or have or benefit people that are looking for houses. It seems like it's mostly benefiting like old people that have already profited from years and years of accruing home value. And then all that aside, it probably shouldn't even be on the ballot anyway. So for me, I'm definitely going to vote no on it. But I mean, it's a perfect example of something that, you could reasonably be on either side of it. But to me, it ultimately breaks not in favor of whether you agree with it or not, but whether this just doesn't seem appropriate to me to be on the ballot. And then what do you think about this gas and vehicle tax one, Proposition 6?
From what I've looked into where this is going to go, supposedly it's mostly going to go towards road construction and maintenance.
Well, sorry, can we let's describe what it is exactly?
Yeah, so we already passed a gas tax in 2017, and is it true all this does is repeal that or not?
Right, it repeals it. Yeah. So the technical, the description is a yes vote will repeal fuel tax increases and vehicle fees that were enacted in 2017, including the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, and require voter approval via ballot proposition for the California state legislature to impose, increase, or extend fuel taxes or vehicle fees in the future. That's just the literal reading. I mean, basically what's saying is, in the past, we increased taxes on fuel and vehicles. This is going to repeal that, and to me, this is the more important part. It will require voter approval via ballot proposition to increase taxes in the future. So it's not just about repealing the previous law. It's about setting a new, standard for how we can change law in the future. It says we will require ballot propositions.
So that's weird. So it's like, a yes on this says we're repealing this tax because it was a bad idea, but also this is the only way that you're ever going to get a tax this way ever again in California. It has to be a proposition.
It's very confusing to me.
Yeah, it's kind of odd.
It may be that I'm not misunderstanding it. Levinson says, Prop 6 repeals the, quote, good and important fuel tax, but much more importantly, it makes it even harder than it already is to raise fuel and vehicle taxes in the future.
Yeah, it's weird that it does two things. From what I've looked into this, the fuel tax, like whatever you thought about it in 2017, there's already been like projects using that money are already underway. So it's going to put those in a weird position, assuming it does get repealed. Personally, I'm leaning towards a no Wait, yeah, a no,
Yeah.
as in like leave it alone. I'm not sure. I don't remember how I voted on this the last time around, but yeah.
Who does?
Yeah, I know, right?
Who does? I don't remember what I was eating for dinner yesterday. So
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think if you look at like the independent reviews for like what areas have the worst maintained roads in the country, I think the like Oakland, San Francisco area is actually the worst in the country.
it doesn't surprise me from driving around.
Yeah, I know, right? Supposedly they also have the highest standard, so I don't know how you actually measure that, but yeah, it seems like a good idea to use fuel taxes to repair roads, and since that's already underway, repealing it seems like a bad idea. Although it seems like from what I've heard, it's going to get repealed. That's the direction that people are leaning.
Yeah. So I don't really understand the mechanics behind all of this. So the Democratic Party opposes this repeal, meaning that they want to keep the taxes in place.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party approves of the appeal, meaning that they want to remove the taxes. I mean, I suppose this is just the classic position of Democrats are more pro-tax and Republicans are more anti-tax. And I suppose that's that's reasonable. I'm likely to vote no on this one as well, aka keep the tax in place, because I think it makes perfect sense to tax vehicles and fuel for roads.
Yeah.
I would think that would actually be in line with the Republican Party tax philosophy, which is you tax stuff. Things that you tax should be paid for. Like if you're gonna pay for roads, that should come out of fuel taxes, because that's the people who are using the roads. I mean, it kind of makes sense. I don't know what their alternative view on it would be. I mean, maybe the idea is they just want to make it harder to pass tax increases in general.
Yeah.
Like maybe they're like, we shouldn't have the state legislature be passing tax increases. Like that should be open. That should be available to the public to decide every time. But I think that's silly. I think that's actually exactly the thing that we want the state legislature to be deciding. I don't want the public to be involved in these like wonky policy debates about exactly which taxes should be paying for exactly which things. So funny enough, I would actually oppose this repeal, but I might have also opposed the original tax referendum. So these things can get weird. Let's see, what's the readability on this one as well? Grade level 16, so that's not too bad. It's like university graduate level.
That's like average for this year.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, I'm going to be thrilled that's at a grade level that I can technically read it according to this score. I mean, obviously the score it's not a perfect metric.
They kind of vary a little bit. Like you've only been mentioning the FRKL or whatever, but for that one the FRE graded it at 31.
Well, yeah, that's it's a different metric. So this one is about grade level 15, but the FRE is a different.
So it doesn't correspond to actual like grades.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So here, this is the flesh. Why is it flesh? The flesh reading ease. It's like you're reading somebody's skin.
If your name is Flesh, just don't invent anything. We don't want to say your name.
Except like sausages. Yeah, so the Flesh, what is it? So the FRE formula produces a score between a negative number and 100, with the highest score representing a 5th grade equivalent reading level and scores at or below 0 representing college graduate equivalent reading level.
Okay, so
this is totally
higher.
Inverse. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. So in this case, 100 is like the are you smarter than a 5th grader, level of reading, where it's like, school children should be able to understand this. And so that's like a good score. And then like a 0 score is only college graduates can understand this law, therefore it shouldn't be a law, basically. I mean, I don't think it specifically states that philosophy, but that's what I think it's getting at. Okay, this one's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Prop 7. This I think is the most, this is like this is the maverick proposition here.
Yeah.
This is the one that doesn't really seem like it has to do with any of the other ones, but it's super interesting to me. So California Proposition 7, permanent daylight saving time measure. A yes vote supports allowing the California State Legislature to change the dates and times of the daylight savings time period as consistent with federal law by a 2/3 vote and establish permanent year-round DST in California by a 2/3 vote if the federal law is changed to allow it.
So does that mean the federal law has to allow California to do it, or the federal law will change the whole country? I don't know.
Yeah, so the way that I like, you can sort of like read the history about it. Basically, there's some federal law, I think it was going on around World War II time, where they basically said, okay, everybody, for the purposes of like national unity and productivity / like not having kids walk home in the dark or something like this, we're going to allow permanent daylight savings time. So we're not going to change. Oh, here it says, so California and the entire United States had permanent DST, daylight savings time, between 1942 and 1945. FDR labeled permanent DST as, quote, wartime because the change was intended to save energy during World War II. And then so later after that, Richard Nixon signed legislation to enact permanent DST for a period of 16 months as a response to OPEC-backed oil embargo. So there's just been a couple windows in time where the federal government said, like, this is the thing, everybody's going to have permanent daylight savings time. But I think right now this is not a thing. I don't know the history well, but something happened that said that it's no longer a thing. You can't have permanent daylight savings time. And then so now a yes vote would say, in the future, if federal law demands it, then we can go into permanent daylight savings time. Or California could just pass a thing that says we want to do it.
So this is a weird one. I think it seems like the against argument, like the main one is like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and then the concern about kids going to school in the morning, like 8:45 and it's still pitch black or something. It looked like that was the reason that it was overturned after Nixon put it into place federally. So I mean, if I'm like California's czar, I think that's stupid. Just like we shouldn't be sending kids to school at 8 a.m. anyway. It's pretty ridiculous.
Maybe we'll finally change this.
Let them fucking sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what concerns me, I guess, is being off of like the rest of the country's clock permanently. Isn't there one other state that's like that, like Arizona?
Arizona doesn't change.
Yeah.
I don't remember if they're always on daylight savings time or if they're always off of it.
Yeah.
But it's one or the other of those.
Yeah, so I mean, I would prefer if federally we were all on the same page here, and I don't think like daylight savings time doesn't make a ton of sense to me anyway. My perfect world, the whole country would adopt this measure, and it seems like California is kind of the state that does that kind of thing. You know, we pick up the weird laws that end up getting carried by like we're the lab experiment state, especially for like the progressive ideas. And so this is one that makes sense to me, and I think if it's going to start somewhere, it's going to start in California. It's probably not going to just be a federal law out of nowhere. So yeah, I mean, the downside doesn't seem that great to me, that I would be staunchly opposed to it.
I mean, if this is going to have, if this is going to fail one of Levinson's criteria, it's going to be the importance criteria. Because obviously this doesn't really matter that much one way or the other. It's not even saying that we want to have permanent daylight savings time. It's just saying it's just allowing the state legislature to vote on that.
Like we could if we wanted. Yeah.
And it's by 2/3, so it'd have to be like a solid majority of people who wanted
presumably, if this passes, they will vote on it. I mean, it depends on what the vote looks like, I guess, but
yeah, but I mean, either way, it still will require. It still has to be consistent with federal law, regardless.
Yeah.
And so this isn't going to change anything indefinitely. It's just saying if the time comes, then we have the ability to change this. That's what you're voting yes or no on. And to me, I like having that greater flexibility.
Yeah.
And so even though it's not like critically important, I would still vote yes on this because it seems like fairly mild. And I believe that Levinson also supported on this one, even though it's obviously not of huge importance, but it seems like something we should be able to decide if we wanted to. And it's kind of fun. I mean, this is one of those things like banning the penny, where like obviously it doesn't really matter that much, but
it just makes sense.
It just makes sense, exactly.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't. Get it? Cents? Pennies? Anyway. Okay, so now Prop 8. This one is also like, do you hate sick people or not? This would be limits on dialysis clinics revenue and required refunds initiative. So a yes vote requires dialysis clinics to issue refunds to patients or patients' payers for revenue above 115% of the costs of direct patient care and healthcare improvements. So correct this summary if I'm wrong, but I think it's basically saying like providers of dialysis shouldn't make that much profit. And there's like a cap on the profits of dialysis providers, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's basically like it's almost like price fixing. I mean, it doesn't set a particular price, but it kind of does, because it's saying there's like a cap on how much revenue you can make off of this. So I suppose by one framing you would say, this prevents the blood sucking vampire health insurance companies from extracting profit out of like needy people. And then the alternative view of it is this is like full socialist, market price controlling of healthcare, and we don't want the government to be sort of like turning the knobs on these market levers. I mean, personally, I would vote no on it, but is that the way that you're thinking about it? How do you see it?
This one is like a prime candidate for this Levinson test. I think it fails probably all three of them, all three of the concerns. Even if this was a good idea, like this is just a bad way of going about it. If I was concerned about dialysis patients not being able to afford care or something like that, like this isn't what I would do. The solution to that problem isn't, okay, let's decentivize the creation of new dialysis facilities.
Yeah.
Like that's a bad way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, basically it just cements the existing dialysis providers.
Yeah.
Like, because there's no way to ever compete if you can't make more profit than them.
Yeah.
Like, there's literally, it's like completely anti-competitive.
Yeah, and I assume at least some of them are going to close because of this. So yeah, like if
yes, certainly. Like,
yeah,
there's it's almost guaranteed that would happen.
Yeah. So if you're like pro dialysis patient, I don't know if this does quite what you want it to do.
I like this is really funny when you look at the support and opposition groups. The support group is Californians for Kidney Dialysis Patient Protection. And the opposition group is Patients and Caregivers to Protect Dialysis Patients. So it's like, who cares more about the patients?
It's like Super PAC Mad Libs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, because like presumably the argument in favor of this is something like, it's too expensive, dialysis patients can't afford it, we need to bring costs down, and the way we're going to bring costs down is just crush competition in the free market.
Yeah.
We really don't want anybody to make any profits out of this, and that's how we're going to decrease cost, is by just like taking profits out of the insurance company's hands and putting it into the hands of the patients. But ultimately, that like in the long term sense, it just doesn't make any sense. Like there's a lot of reasons why you want to enact like regulations and cost control, price controls, and redistributive policies and all of these things. But none of those aims reduce costs of goods. They all will increase cost of goods and services. That's how it works. Yeah. It's like saying, oh, we need, we really care about climate change. Let's like pass a gas tax, and also that'll make gas way less expensive.
Yeah.
It's like, of course it's not. Like the whole point is to make it more expensive. So I mean, and especially if you're not paying for the dialysis directly, you're paying indirectly through insurance, then really all this is going to do is just raise insurance premiums, because the cost has to be borne somewhere.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think it's absurd. I'm definitely a no on that one. Pretty sure Levinson is a for sure no as well. Sorry, I don't want to lean too heavily on Levinson, but his ideas are generally consistent with mine. And I mean, to be honest, you need to have somebody that can like.
I mean, it's a good
digest
baseline.
Some of these for you.
Yeah, it's a good baseline, and we are using his framework to kind of examine some of these. So it makes sense to bounce it off of what he says.
Yeah, one thing that I was having difficulty with when I was evaluating these is I actually don't know who to trust. Like, I don't really want to, like, I'm not going to get my takes on these propositions from like the local newspaper, because I don't really trust the local newspaper to represent my political opinions. And also, you can't get any of this from the bigger national news sources like The Economist or something, which I subscribe to, because obviously they're not going to cover every single state's propositions.
Yeah, I think the prime example for why not to trust the newspapers is in this next one, in Prop 10. There's no Prop 9, right? There's
no Prop 9.
Okay.
I don't understand how the numbering works at all.
Yeah, me either.
This one started over at 1. The measures are even worse, but we'll get to that.
So Prop 10 is Local Rent Control Initiative. And a yes vote allows local governments to adopt rent control on any type of rental housing, thus repealing the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. So Costa-Hawkins was an act passed, like in the 90s?
Early 2000s.
Yeah, that said that you can't do rent control in California. You're not allowed to do it.
Well, is that you can't do it on a local, like municipal level, basically, right? It's like you could still pass such a thing through the California state legislature in the same way that this law was passed.
But if I live in Alameda County and 90% of the people in my county support rent control. We just can't do anything about that.
Right.
A lot of the newspapers are for this, and I think this must just be a lack of understanding on what rent control actually is.
I mean, I think it's just pure virtue signaling, to be honest. Sorry, I mean, continue.
So, I mean, I didn't really understand the implications of rent control when I first started looking into these, but a really cursory Google search will show you that the vast majority of economists think that rent control is a terrible idea in almost every form. Like we were just saying, the way to, if you have a shortage of something, the way to solve that problem is not by enforcing price control on that thing, because that just reduces the supply, and the supply is the problem.
Yeah, and yeah, it restricts development. If a developer is I mean, I'm sure most people who are voting on these laws have not worked for a development company, but I have. And if you worked for a development company, you know that there's not these tight borders around each state. If you're a development company in California and development ends up starting to be really expensive in California, you'll just look at other states. There's nothing stopping you. Yeah. I mean, you're probably registered in Delaware anyway. And so, you evaluate all of the local jurisdictional policies and taxes and the regulatory landscape, and you say, oh look, it's really cheap and profitable to develop in Texas, so I'm going to go build houses over there. And the worse it is in California, the less likely you're going to build housing there. Or maybe the incentives are stacked in such a way that you have to build luxury houses to make any profit. Yeah. And that's what you're seeing now in San Francisco. And so it's okay, if you want to build more housing, you have to loosen up these regulations. And so the cost of that is, if you have less regulations, then there could be, you could have noisy construction around your houses, or your skyline could be less beautiful, or I'm framing that in a certain way, but the point is, maybe there's certain externalities or costs, social costs, that you want to account for, but the upside is that you increase supply and you decrease cost, decrease cash, direct cost. I mean, what we're seeing in California with this NIMBY versus YIMBY sort of mindsets, those are not in my backyard and yes in my backyard development paradigms. There's no way to get around it. If you build less housing, it's going to be more expensive. Yeah. And you can arbitrarily set prices and say, okay, there's a law that you have to only charge this much for your houses, and then, or your apartments or rent or whatever, but then you're just going to get less developers there. Landlords are not going to want to be there. I don't think there's any way around that.
So the counter argument to that, the LA Times, or the what is it, the who
supports it?
Yeah, there's an LA newspaper that supported this.
Well, in terms of on the party levels, it's basically the Democratic Party, the Green Party, and the Peace and Freedom Party support it.
Scroll up a little bit. Oh yeah, LA Times. So I read their article. I don't know if that's
these are for the last year's propositions.
Yeah, but I believe LA Times supported this one.
Yeah.
So I was reading some of their articles because I want to grok this. I want to figure out why are people supporting this when it's so obvious at this point that rental control is a bad idea. And so their counter argument.
Well, if you oppose it, then you hate poor people. That's obvious.
So their counter argument to what you're saying is basically that, rent control disincentivizes new development, but there's a way to do it where you just pass rent control on existing low-income housing, so that housing drops in price just for the people that need it. But the problem with that is that's not what this law says. This law says any type of rental housing. So if you vote yes on this, you're just kind of trusting local governments to not screw over their citizens, which is a bad assumption to make.
Yeah, I think one of the, obviously, well, not obviously, but what the law does is it just allows local governments to pass rent control laws if they want to. So I think the main pro argument is let local governments do what they want. Isn't the whole point is that we should sort of democratize this? And, if you're going to view states as policy laboratories, why shouldn't local municipal governments also be policy laboratories? Just let them enact rent control. And the problem I have with this is that, again, you can't view these local municipalities as sovereign nations that have border walls and stuff preventing people from coming in. Two neighboring jurisdictions, one could have rent control and one doesn't. And so what happens is, if you're a place that passes a rent control law, then you could create this like incentive structure where, you know, city A, like Fremont or whatever, passes a rent control law, and then their rent is sort of like made artificially low, and then people from other cities will like go to there to like take advantage of that rent control law, and then in order to prevent people from leaving the city, then, you know, city B, neighboring city, Hayward or whatever, has to now pass a rent control law.
Yeah.
And then you sort of get this like bubbling out effect, and then the sort of states rightist view of this is these consequences are really complicated and it's not clear how we should think about these laws. Therefore, it has to be passed at a state legislature level, not through referendum. And then there's the economist view of rent control is just bad in any way, so we should just pass a law to stop it.
That's the that's the real problem with this, like the lab experiment argument, is we've done the experiment. We know what rent control does now. There are literally zero economists that they'll tell you rent control is a great idea. Like literally zero.
Yeah, but they're all white supremacists, so they just hate the poor brown people. And I mean, I have heard this argument as well. This is one of the problems of this is one of the possible risks of passing law based on how it sounds, or like how you feel about it, even if you have done a bit more research, like even if you're more informed about it. Because I was talking to one of my housemates, and you know, God bless her soul, she's like a beautiful human being. But when she was talking about this particular thing, she went to a talk of, you know, some local Oakland, like people of color meetup. And someone was talking about how, specifically this Proposition 10, because it would allow rent control policies, and these could particularly favor like disadvantaged, especially like people of color groups that, or citizens, interest groups, then therefore we need to allow these sort of laws to be passed, because at the end of the day, once you weigh all of these different policy, you know, considerations, you have to support the policies that benefit people of color the most. And in this case, you know, the claim is that if you're not supporting this law, then that means you don't want poor people who are disproportionately like Black and Latino to be able to afford housing. And that's who is getting hurt by the, you know, housing crisis the most, and who needs rent control the most. And so she was like, I realize that's complicated and I want to do more research, but ultimately I have to break in favor of whatever is going to help people of color right now. And to me, it's kind of like, it's almost kind of disgusting that not her, but like the sort of the political spin being put on it, which is like, if you don't support this law, then therefore you don't care about poor people. Yeah. It's like, I want poor people to be afforded housing, and I think that the best way of accomplishing that is by building more housing.
And voting yes on 1 and 2.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like to me, those are the ways that you start being able to build this up, is vote for like additional programs, like loans, like maybe even subsidies to support housing. Like even in this case, if you want poor people to be able to afford housing, why implement a rent control law when you can instead implement a like housing voucher for people of lower income bracket law or something like this? I mean, it'd be the exact same effect, but without messing with the market price.
Without doing like the one thing that all economists can agree on is terrible.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, what, do you hate economists if you vote yes on this? Like, economists are people too. Hashtag economist lives matter. Okay, so, I mean, we're both solidly no on that, so is Levinson. Okay, so California Proposition 11, do you hate ambulance workers or not? Sorry, I misread that. It's called Ambulance Employees Paid On-Call Breaks, Training, and Mental Health Services Initiative. A vote yes allows ambulance providers to require workers to remain on call during breaks paid at their regular rate, requires employers to provide additional training for EMTs and paramedics, requires employers to provide EMTs and paramedics with some paid mental health services, and requires employers to bake birthday cakes for EMTs on their birthdays as well as their half birthdays. Just kidding about that last one. But that, I mean, you can maybe already see how I'm going to predict how I'll vote on this one. What do you think about this one?
I'm a little bit ambivalent. The first thing that this supports is allowing ambulance providers to require workers to remain on call during breaks paid at their regular rate. So like that's kind of the main thrust of this proposition, is like, should EMTs and paramedics remain on call during their breaks and be paid for that? I think what sways me the most is that would bring it in line with other emergency services. I think this is something that's already true with police officers and with firefighters. They're already required to remain on call during breaks. So, I mean, that part makes sense. I don't really know what provide additional training and provide mental health services means. Like, I don't know what the details of that are.
I mean, I mean, personally, I don't know that much about EMTs, so yeah. I'm not speaking from like a well of deep knowledge here. But my understanding is it's basically saying like EMTs don't get as much, they need more training and they need more like support and services. And so we are going to try and pass a law to require that this is given to them because they don't have enough bargaining power, or it's not a healthy like market environment that is hiring them. Maybe there's some fundamental lack of competition between EMT employers, and so to me it doesn't meet it doesn't satisfy the requirements. And also because I'm not educated on the topic, my default is to vote no. Like, I'm not going to pass a law that benefits a very small, like very specific group of people. I mean, this is a special interest if you could even possibly come up with one. To me, this is not the appropriate way to do this.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this would be a different... I might have a different opinion on this if it was just the first third requiring them to remain on call during breaks. I think that would be like kind of a different initiative.
Well, it's not only requiring them, it's allowing ambulance providers to require them. Yeah. And so that's sort of like this is the more, quote, free market framing of it, which is allow ambulance providers to do what they want, including this particular thing. But then it sort of stacks on these specific requirements of you must provide this additional training, and which is like, what does that even mean? I have no idea. Are they not trained enough? And then you must provide them with paid mental health services, and it's like, what does that mean also? Yeah, like it's this isn't even something that I feel like I don't even want to look into this because it doesn't feel appropriate for this referendum.
Yeah, for what it's worth, AMR, which is the leading, it's the biggest EMS service in the state. AMR actually supports this. They are willing to take on the extra training and the mental health services if they're allowed to require their workers to work on call. I've heard that's probably because they're doing this already and they don't want to get in trouble for it.
You've really looked into this one then.
I have a small background in EMS, so I'm familiar with AMR and some of their practices. Yeah, but still, it is kind of like a black box initiative. It's hard to really figure out what exactly the specifics are. And it's weird that all three of them are kind of grouped together in one referendum.
Well, it seems like the way you were describing it, it's almost a deal. It's almost like a negotiation where they're saying, we want to be able to require our people to be on call during breaks, and therefore, we'll accept these additional requirements. Yeah. And it's an interesting negotiation. It's something that I could imagine, going to a talk and hearing people talk about it for an hour and thinking, interesting points on both sides. But to me, it's not appropriate for a referendum.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Levinson agrees on this. So, there's some background here. Prop 11 involves an ambulance company labor dispute and a huge lawsuit that said ambulance company wants to get out of paying for.
Probably AMR.
yeah, exactly. Don't fall for the disingenuous, quote, public safety argument in the TV ads are making. This is a clear no.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like AMR is trying to get out of this labor dispute.
Pro side, the grade level required is only 14, so you only have to be a university student to understand it. Yeah. It's not bad. You don't have to have a PhD or anything. Oh, sorry, that was Proposition 10. Maybe this one's worse. What is 11? This is kind of fun to look into these things now. It's nice to have a number. Oh, only grade level 14 as well. That's pretty good. Okay, so last one, Proposition 12, another spicy one. To me, this is kind of like the daylight savings one. I mean, not really. Anyway, Proposition 12, Farm Animal Confinement Initiative. Very readable. Props for that one. Establish minimum space requirements based on square feet for calves raised for veal, breeding pigs, and egg-laying hens, and ban the sale of veal from calves, pork from breeding pigs, and eggs from hens when the animals are confined to areas below minimum square feet requirements. So this is split into two things, but it really just means it's just requiring minimum space for these certain types of animals.
Yeah, so this one's related to a bill that was passed in 2008, where, if you go back and read that bill, it kind of seems like this is what should have happened with that bill. And I think that's kind of why this is on the ballot, is it's specifically laying out the requirements for how these animals should be treated. I'm not sure what the downside is to changing the requirements here, other than like more expensive meat. I think this is kind of like really an animal cruelty intuition. Like, you know, where is your empathy lie for meat animals?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to basically align with Levinson on this one in that I mean, I'm an interesting case because if you don't know me, I'm essentially morally speaking, I'm vegan, which is to say that I'm not really an activist, and I generally don't get involved in like politics or preaching regarding vegetarian or veganism.
You just quietly eat your rabbit food alone.
Exactly. I just graze when I get home. I'm very private about my grazing. So when I'm home, I eat vegan food pretty much exclusively. And then when I go out to eat, because I don't want to be too restrictive, I allow myself to eat vegetarian. But I pretty much never eat meat except in very extreme circumstances, and I have a very sort of individualistic moral view on that. But when it comes to this particular law, I'm half and half about, but I break in favor of no. The reason is because even though I support the moral background of this, of not, you know, I'm not a huge supporter of veal as a quasi-vegan, say vegetarian, and I only buy like pasture raised, like the most sort of morally produced eggs when I do, and usually I don't ever buy eggs. But that being said, I think that this isn't this goes in the category of stuff that's not appropriate to pass by a referendum. I think it's too specific, and I think if you're going to pass something like this for a referendum, it should be some part of the Constitution that specifically grants rights to non-human animals. And I think this doesn't do that. It's sort of the ultimate extension of this is you have like 30 different, like layered upon, like slightly nuanced, you know, it's like a decision tree of, okay, are you a veal raised calf, or are you an adult cow? Are you a dairy cow, or are you a breeding pig, or are you a free range hen?
Yeah.
And then in all these different situations, what do you do? And to me, that's not a good way of crafting law. If I'm going to see a law passed, especially if it's to me, this is inherently a rights-based law. Like, what sort of rights do these animals have? And I would say that this is the wrong way to go about it. Now, ultimately, this is the type of law that should be passed in a referendum, but only if it was more generally applicable. I don't think that this is sort of the right way to go about animal rights law.
So your problem with this, can you scroll back up to the text?
Yeah, sure.
So your problem with this is kind of that it says calves raised for veal, breeding pigs, and egg-laying hens, and you'd be more amenable to this if it just said like all farm animals or like all animal product. I don't know.
Well, and it establishes minimum space requirements. So we saw a similar thing in the past when people will pass laws saying, okay, we want things to be. We want our eggs to be, quote, free range, or we want our beef to be like organic or grass fed or whatever. And so people have these sort of labels that is individually ascribed or prescribed to these different types of food or different types of animals. And the idea is every time we establish moral progress, we have to specifically delineate which types of labels we apply to all these situations, and that's how we're going to like build our laws around these things. And I think that's just like way too specific and limiting. I think this is not like the principled approach to rights that I would like to see. This would sort of be like the equivalent of passing the Bill of Rights, but instead of passing the Bill of Rights, for the First Amendment, you say men between the ages of 30 and 25 and women between the ages of like 18 and 16 can vote on bills if they own 1/2 acre of land or something. It doesn't. To me, it's just not a good way of approaching this sort of law, and it also could have unintended consequences on like both an economic and also a cultural level. I could certainly see a case where you've got existing farmers that have these sort of outfits that they're selling this meat, and it's not like these are necessarily fat cat business people who have been fed with a silver spoon since birth. Maybe these are like sort of salts of the earth, like Trump supporter types who don't want the government too involved in their business, and this sort of proposition could sort of cleave them from sort of the rest of society in a way that I don't think is productive for political discourse. Now, of course, the question is, where do animal rights fall into that? Because at a certain point, no matter when or how you legislate animal rights, there's going to be that interaction a little bit. And it just feels to me like this isn't the right way to do it. Like, this isn't how I would want to pass laws about this. And also, another thing that would happen is you could very easily just, again, going back to the housing development thing, you could just take farmers that are doing the same thing here and just put them into another state. It doesn't really solve the problem. It just sort of forces business out of California. And I don't think that's the right way of going about it either. So, I mean, like, morally, I am slightly confused about this topic, and I could see myself voting yes or no either way. But I think that the ultimate way to, my approach to vegan activism is basically through capitalism. Like, I want to demand products that are alternatives to meat, that taste good and are cheap. And I think this doesn't address that in any way whatsoever. And it also doesn't address the rights issue anyway. And so that's the types of laws that I would want to see are stuff like take away subsidies from like meat and farming industries and divert them to like meat alternatives. Allow stuff like plant-based mayo to be labeled as mayonnaise and doesn't have to be labeled as like a fakeanaise.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, okay, so I think I have some slight conceptual issues with where you're going with this. I think it's fine if you think that this doesn't belong on a referendum, but I don't see why it's unreasonable to say, okay, if you're like raising a living being for profit on your land, that like living conscious creature has to be able to like you have to provide them a certain level of space in which to live, and that's what the previous proposition tried to do. Like 10 years ago, it said like they need to be able to turn around, lie down, stand up, fully extend their limbs, and we thought that would give them a certain amount of space, and it didn't,
right.
To the degree that the supporters of this proposition wanted. So this instead of saying, okay, they have to be able to exhibit these behaviors, we're just saying, okay, they need this much minimum square feet, which is actually a more like that's a more definable and less vague like way of going about it anyway. So I don't know. I guess I'm split on this. I think this might be the one proposition here where my criticism of Levinson's article kind of comes into play. I think this makes enough sense to me that I don't mind that it's on the referendum. I think we already passed something similar enough from a referendum, and this just kind of defines those terms in a way that makes sense. So I think I'll probably go yes.
Well, people also thought that the previous referendum made sense, and it didn't really, right? Like, It didn't really have the effect that people expected. And I suspect that this will not have the effect that people suspected either. I mean, so there's sort of two ways that you can go. So ignore the political process part of it. Say that you're just looking at it from like an animal suffering, like utilitarian perspective. I would say, you could either look at it from a utilitarian perspective or like a rights-based sort of deontologist perspective, like what sort of rights do we grant to non-human animals, and how do we determine like what the bounds of those rights are. And so to me, on a utilitarian level, it's not clear at all that this is a good way of going about this, because like I said, one, I think that the sort of capitalist approach, maybe capitalist is the wrong way of going about it, but a supply side approach of like how do we get alternatives, like maybe we should invest more in research into plant-based alternatives to meat or dairy, or maybe we should roll back subsidies to farmers so that there's a more competitive landscape for meat alternatives, stuff like this. I mean, I think those sorts of things could really make a real difference. Or even just something simple like the sale of extra suffering meat, like veal or breeding pigs or egg-laying hens. You know, there's some tax on it or something, and then that tax gets to go to subsidies for plant-based meat or something like that. And I feel like on a utilitarian level, that has much more potential for impact than this very particular law of space requirements, especially because it'd be so easy to just move these guys out of California. Like,
well, yeah, but then you like that only works to a degree, because it's not like these farmers can go out of California and then still sell into California. Like this bans the sale of any meat or eggs that don't meet these requirements. So you can't import beef from Texas if those cows are confined to an area below this requirement. So this is something that could affect other states as well.
Yeah, that is true. That is
We've
true.
got like 25 million people here eating meat.
Right. So my criticism isn't on that front is kind of weak. I agree with that. I mean, I also haven't really fully considered this, so maybe I do need to do a little bit more introspection on it. But it still strikes me as being sort of overly specific and what would you say? Patronizing isn't the right word. What do you call it when a father paternalistic?
Okay.
Of like you have to sort of obey these certain rules or else it's not like morally right. I mean, I feel that one, it should be an individual decision anyway, which is why I personally have like made this choice for myself, but don't really like impose it that much on others. And I also think that this is not a solid rights-based approach to addressing this moral issue. It's also not a solid utilitarian approach either.
I mean, it's not an ideal proposition, but I don't think that we're gonna get one that meets a high ideal. It's going to be really difficult, especially just through the regular legislature. Not enough people care about this, I think.
Yeah, but I think it's one of those cases where if people don't care enough about it to make a difference in individual consumption, I don't think it makes sense to sort of legislatively coerce that decision and like disallow that from being an option for people. I mean, there's a different moral argument here, which also goes like people that have lower incomes that have eaten a certain type of food for their entire lives and they're not really switching anytime soon. You know, it sort of forces them into paying more for food that like maybe they can't even like afford better food than that. And the people that would benefit the most from this is people who are already only eating grass-fed. My neighbor owns cows.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could see a way that it would benefit me. Like I eat meat. I eat a lot of meat just due to my diet. But like it's really hard to tell when you look at a package of meat, like under what circumstances that animal lived.
Right.
It's really difficult to tell. I appreciate labels like cage free and free range. I think those are good, useful labels to have. I don't know like technically what the correct moral space requirement is for animals, but if some farms are like getting around the 2008 proposition by just allowing them just barely enough space so that they can, make these specific movements, but it's actually like smaller than it was before or something.
Yeah.
I could see that being a good idea. So I mean, I don't begrudge you for taking the Levinson approach here. I think that's fine, but I don't see the downsides as being so dramatic that I would vote no.
Yeah, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it too, I'm not actually sure how much I specifically align with Levinson here, just because none of my objections are by any of those like criteria, except maybe importance, I guess.
Yeah.
And it does seem like it's not really, like, obviously for a vegan, it would seem more important. Like, I do think that animal rights are an important issue that not enough people think about. I just don't see this as making like a significant progress in that regard. I mean, to your point about like, yeah, we'll never have an ideal law, and that is probably true. Like there's an argument for a certain incrementalist approach here. I just don't see an incrementalist approach by referendum as being like a good way of going about it. And especially to your point about like appreciating labels, I mean, I think that's good too. And I want consumers to have that information, but then this doesn't even give them that information, really. It just sets like a hard rule of you can't even sell that stuff here.
Yeah.
And so if someone wants to make a trade-off of, do I buy more ethical meat for a higher cost, then they can't even make that decision because it's sort of made for them by the law. And I do feel like that should be, driven by consumer decisions. And I could see an argument either way. I mean, at the end of the day, which is apparently my new favorite phrase, at the end of the day, I could see voting yes or no on this, and I split in favor of no. But I mean, the irony is unavoidable that I basically don't eat any meat ever, and I'm probably going to vote no. And then you're like a massive meat eater, and you vote yes.
That's Grokking points, right? Like,
yeah,
that's what we're here for.
Yeah, exactly. Oh boy, okay, that was pretty good. I think that was the last one, right? Number 12. Big props to this one. It has a reasonable level of reading level. Ballot summary is grade level 12. I think This is the lowest one of all the propositions. You just have to graduate high school to be able to understand this. And from reading it, I agree. It's fairly straightforward. Yeah. This is exactly the type of verbiage I would like to see. And so I actually think it passes a few of Levinson's criteria, except I really don't think it passes the... or I think it's borderline on the importance one, and that really depends on how you view animal rights.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I would like to briefly talk about measures, mostly because I have a funny joke relating to them.
Okay.
And I think that these are sort of the hardest thing for people to reason about because they're so like wonky and specific to local areas.
Yeah.
And we're not going to go through the local. I mean, we're from different counties because I'm from Alameda County and you're from what is it?
No,
what
we're
is
from
it?
the same county. We're in different districts.
Sorry, different districts. So you're also in Alameda County.
Yeah.
Okay, right. What is your district?
I'm district. What are you? 13?
I think so. Oakland.
Okay, I'm 15 then.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll have... How does it work? Do we have some overlapping measures, or are measures totally different? They're totally
I didn't even look
district-specific?
into the measures, to be honest.
Yeah, I started looking into them, and it's just... There's just so... Well, obviously, these aren't all going to apply to me, because these are all the ones for Alameda County, and it will be different by district. But there's so many different ones, and especially if, a lot of people will live in a certain area, and they might be registered to vote in that area, but they, commute in another area, or their parents are from another area. And so there's a lot of, there's a district intersectionality going on where people will have interest in a bunch of these different measures and propositions. And then even for the local ones, a lot of the Oakland ones, I don't care that much about. And I can't even tease them out from all of the other measures that there are, which there's A through triple Z. And so even reading all of these, it reminds me of this scene from Vampire's Kiss with Nicolas Cage. Do you know this movie?
I've never heard
this
of
is this cult classic where, I mean, obviously this has nothing to do with anything, but this is a movie from the 90s where Nicolas Cage becomes convinced that he's a vampire and he starts going crazy. And let me show you this scene. This is my view on the ballot measures.
Sometimes somebody puts a document in the wrong file and then it's misfiled. It makes it much harder to find.
Who? What do you mean, who?
I don't know who exactly.
You don't?
No, I don't. Whoever filed it in the first place, but for God's sakes, Peter, I am not telling you one single thing you don't already know.
How could somebody misfile something? What could be easier? It's all alphabetical. You just put it in the right file, according to alphabetical order. A, B, C, D, E, F, G,
Peter.
H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P,
Peter.
Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Huh? That's all you have to do.
Very good. You know your alphabet.
I never misfiled anything. Not once, not one time.
I'm sure that you didn't.
I never misvoted any measure. Oh boy. Okay. Yeah. So to me, we're not going to go into these in particular, but I just want to express my general frustration at how many things there are and how I honestly feel kind of bad as a citizen that I don't care more about this stuff, because ultimately I do feel like it is kind of your moral responsibility to be involved in local politics, pay attention to what's going on. And that's really the way that you should be participating, instead of just giving your opinion on Trump or on Brett Kavanaugh or whatever, on these national, intangible cultural war topics.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's also so wonky and particular to your local area. And we live in a very global interconnected world. And it's hard to really care about these things. And especially when everyone has these different measures. They're all these different letter combinations that you can't really attach anything to. You don't really understand what measure AA means. I mean, that's a problem with the propositions as well. But at least you can engage in a conversation about that with your parents or something. Yeah. And you can look at the signs and be like, oh yes, on Prop 1, I know what that means. But who the fuck knows what measure EE means and why? You said you haven't looked at them yet, right?
No.
So do you have a way that you're going to approach this? Are you going to even vote on them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, my approach should just be kind of the same approach I have for the propositions, but God, there's just so many of them. It's really hard. That's why newspapers and that kind of thing are useful. But it's so hard when we've already gone over propositions that the newspapers are so obviously wrong about. It's hard to know what to trust, when you're making a really wonky decision like this. So I'm really not sure. I'll look over them probably 2 days before the voting day, and yeah, I hope I get them right. I don't know.
I mean, there's also nothing. Well, one thing that's nice about the local elections is there's not as much question about whether or not they're right. Like you can sort of be okay just voting for whatever you want, because kind of the point is that the more local it is, the more it should represent your interest as like the person who's living there. You're not like making a moral decision about how like rural people in Arkansas should be paying for their health care.
Yeah, but you also have way more power.
Right.
You know, if I'm voting on one of these California propositions, I might be one of like a couple million people that are idiots and happen to get it wrong or like read it incorrectly. But if I'm voting on a local measure, I'm like probably one of a few thousand people in my area that are actually going to vote on that in a responsible way. You know, that's a lot of power, like relative to what's actually getting done.
Yeah, I mean the Spider-Man rule applies, right? Like great power comes great responsibility. Yeah. Why did Spider-Man popularize that? I feel like this should have been like a well-known thing, but I only know it from Spider-Man.
He's the only responsible superhero.
I suppose so. Also one of the least powerful, kind of ironic. Seems like Superman doesn't really care that much about responsibility, but he's like super OP. He's just like, do I save this girl that I like or the entire universe? Yeah, I mean, again, I think that in an ideal world, I would be more focused on local politics because I do view that as like, because I have that extra power and because I have like skin in the game, I actually live here and I should in principle know about the local issues. And it makes more sense for me to be deciding the fate of my city than it does, or my district, than it does for me to be deciding the fate of like the nation or of the world or NATO or whatever it is. Part of why I'm not as inclined is just because I know I'm not going to live here for the long term. Like, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, I'm pretty young. I'm probably not going to buy a house here because it's so expensive. I'm likely to kind of move around a bit. So I don't have a lot of direct investment in the community. I'm basically the people that the gentrification crowd complains about, because I'm just like a young yuppie that moved in here and, you know, commutes to the city. And, you know, I'm probably not going to buy a home. I don't really go to like the local city council stuff. I don't go to the community barbecues. Yeah. I'm kind of just like a leech on the on the local community. So in the future, if I, you know, sell down a place and I have, you know, my kids start going to school there and I start, you know, I'm part of I'm paying HOA fees and stuff like that, I might be more incentivized to care about the local politics, and maybe I'll even eventually get involved. Like it wouldn't surprise me if when I'm, you know, 50 or so, I decide to start running for city council or something. But I feel like at this juncture, I'm not that invested, and I do feel like a lot of people are, I mean, especially young people and like fresh, like university graduates that are kind of switching from job to job every other year, and it's really hard to feel like an identity with where you live. Yeah. And I assume you feel that way to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, right? And it doesn't help that there's no identity in any of these measures. Like, it's so hard to attach them to anything real.
I mean, there's some level of like bike shedding that goes on, right? Which is like there's these very particular issues that doesn't feel important enough. It doesn't feel like it's something that you can tie your your identity or your moral framework to. It's like, how much money exactly do we spend on, you know, how do we deal with school board accountability of its fiscal budget this year, or like how do we deal with retirement pensions for police officers that live within this like 5-block radius or something. Yeah. But like I said, I do want to get more involved. I am going to read the measures and try to vote as informedly as possible. And I don't have the exact same philosophy as I do on the statewide propositions. And I wouldn't necessarily follow Levinson's advice. I mean, I do think in general, I'm more likely to vote no than the average person, just because I really, really don't like this incentive structure of if you get something on the ballot, then people will just vote on it. And I think in California, there's this like strong yes vote bias. Mm-hmm. And especially in a progressive place like Oakland, I can imagine that happening. So I'll conscientiously vote no on quite a lot of things, I believe.
Yep. All right.
Okay, that was Grokking Points. Follow us on Twitter.
Yeah, do that.
Do we have a Reddit yet?
I'm parked on the name.
Wait, what does that mean? Like we have a subreddit, it's just empty?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm the mod.
Oh, wait, does it have any followers?
Me.
Dude, subscribe to us on. I'm not even subscribed to it. Subscribe to us on Reddit. I'll do that. We'll have two. We'll have 2 followers. Yeah. We can post episode threads and stuff. Yeah. That'd be fun. Okay. Okay. Follow us on Reddit. It'll be up by the time you hear
r/grokkingpoints.
I mean, there'll be a discussion. There'll be a discussion thread about the episode that you can participate in with the two. You can have direct participation with the the show hosts, Travis and I. Exclusive Q&A and feedback. Okay, thanks for listening. Go out and vote unless you're jaded by the political process and don't care. Or also vote no on everything.
Or if you're like totally uninformed, then just don't vote. Just stay home.
Yeah, and vote for the people with the coolest names.
Yeah, screw this like everybody get out and vote.
Yeah, don't vote. Actually, don't vote.
Don't
if
vote
you
at
vote,
all.
vote for no on everything. Especially in California. No on everything, don't vote. You're an idiot. Get grokked.